დიდი მადლობა ბაბუზანებისთვის. დღეს ჩვენ სტუმრად გვყავს შვეიცარიის ელჩი ლუკას ბეგლინგერი. ის არის ახალი ელჩი საქართველოში, მაგრამ ძალიან გამოსტული დიპლომატი, მას უმუშავია კოსოვოში, ის საქართველოში ჩამოსვლამდე იყო ელჩი პოლონეთში და მუშაობდა შვეიცარიის საგარეო საქმეთა სამინისტროში, უკვე დიდი ხანია მუშაობს ამ სფეროში. დღევანდელი თემა არის უაღრესად საინტერესო, ეს არის შვეიცარიის პირდაპირი დემოკრატია. მოგეხსენებათ, რომ შვეიცარია არის სულ უნიკალური ქვეყანა, იმიტომ რომ პოლიტიკური სისტემა, რომელიც იქ არსებობს, არ გავს არც ერთ სხვას და მიუხედავად ამისა, ის არის ღრმად დემოკრატიული სისტემა, არა მხოლოდ პოლიტიკაში, არამედ საზოგადოებრივადაც და დარწმუნებული ვარ, რომ ჩვენთვის ყოველთვის საინტერესო და შეიძლება მოულოდნელიც კი იყოს აღმოჩენა ევროპის შუაგულში აი ესეთი სწორ უნიკალური სისტემის მქონე ქვეყნისა და დარწმუნებული ვარ, რომ თქვენს შეკითხვები და კომენტარებით გვექნებათ ბატონი ელჩი სიამოვნებით გაგცემთ პასუხს. ლექცია იქნება ინგლისურად, დისკუსია ინგლისურად იქნება, მაგრამ დარწმუნებული ეს არ იქნება ჩვენთვის დაბრკოლება. დიდი მადლობა კიდევ ერთხელ და ახლა სიტყვას გადავცემ ბატონ ლუკას ბეგლინგერს. So, Mr. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure for me to have the opportunity to present to you the Swiss political system, and in particular its elements of direct democracy. Your presence here indicates that this is also of interest to you. It's certainly a very special topic. The Swiss consider that they are anyway something quite special in many respects, and certainly the political system, and in particular this direct democracy elements, are something that one can consider as quite unique. The topics here I will go through. I will quickly maybe go into a few essential elements of what makes up Switzerland, then its political system, of which direct democracy is just one element, and then we go a little bit into how this direct democracy works in Switzerland, and then the final question whether this is also could be a model also for other countries. Now, well, I begin with the origins of Switzerland. Of course, we will this year celebrate 725 years of existence of Swiss Confederation. It was until the Napoleonic Wars, and that's why I show here a map of the 18th century, it was a very loose alliance of cantons that are themselves also unequal. There were rural cantons, there were city-states, there were allied regions, and there were even colonies, so to say. So some areas that were actually conquered, like this southern region of Ticino, which is Italian-speaking, big parts of western Switzerland, which is French-speaking. So these were areas that did not actually have the same rights. Well, modern Switzerland was founded in 1848, the 19th century. That's how it looks until today, with one small change. This is today a separate canton, the 26th canton of Jura, which in 1848 still belonged to the canton of Bern. So it's quite an interesting case of separatism. I think you are familiar here in Georgia with this issue. We are quite proud in Switzerland that we managed to solve this quite stingy problem in a civilized and quite legal manner. So there was a whole process, but it only started, so to say, 100 years later, when there was resistance in this kind of Jura, which had historically not belonged to the canton of Bern. It was Catholic, or still is Catholic, etc., etc. So this was solved in this way. Well, we are also, as you of course are certainly aware, a multilingual country. We have 4 national languages. 3 of them, German, French and Italian, are official languages, which means that all the legal texts are published in the 3 languages. In Parliament, there is, of course, a translation. The 4th language, which is spoken here in a few valleys of the canton of Crison, is a national language, but not an official language. It's also somehow difficult because they have, in each of the valley, the language is somehow different, it's dialects, so there is not really a common Romansh. It's also quite close to Italian. You see also that the language borders, so to say, are quite clearly delimited. So here is the Italian-speaking part, the French-speaking, the Germans are the majority, and there are quite clear rules in Switzerland for how to handle this. In particular, there is a territoriality principle. According to the territory, then the schools are, for instance, in French, in the French part. And if you live there, your children will go to French school, even if you are Swiss German or Ticinese. That's quite a clear principle, and I think it helps. So the only canton where it's somehow more complicated is this canton of Crison, because you have German-speaking parts, you have Romansh-speaking parts, and also even 2 valleys with Italian. Well, this is also to show you that also in terms of religions, we are quite a patchwork, and here on this map it's basically the main 2 religions, Catholics and Protestants. Of course, this question created a lot of tensions and even civil wars in Switzerland in the past centuries, but thanks God we overcome this. What is interesting, when you compare this map to the previous map, you will see it overlaps. So it's not that if you're Swiss German that you are a Catholic or Protestant, you may be both, and the same applies to the French-speaking and other parts, our language parts of Switzerland. And it's very important because this means that the Swiss have actually a lot of identities and they overlap, and so you won't have these big cleavages that you have, for instance, in the Balkans. Because in the Balkans, you're Serbian, you're also Orthodox, or you're Albanian, and then you are most of the time Muslim, you may also be Catholic, and of course also in terms of culture. So this makes it objectively maybe more difficult to find a good coexistence. Well, we are also a very diversified country in terms of population and economy. So I will underline this, that we are what I would call a bottom-up country, which grew from small communities to a federal state, and this is also reflected in a quite well-distributed population. Of course, here this is the Alpine arc. Obviously, these valleys are less populated, much less populated than the so-called plateau here, but still, we managed to maintain settlements in practically all the valleys, thanks, of course, in particular to tourism, but also agriculture and other activities. And this, of course, has a political importance, because let's say, decision-making is not concentrated in just one place. Here in Georgia, you have 1/3 of the population already living in Tbilisi. It makes some kind of an unbalance. Now, let's come to the subject, today's subject. So there are actually 3 main pillars, I would argue, that make up the peculiarity of the Swiss political system. It's federalism, which means that we have, as I said, a bottom-up country made up of roughly 2,500 municipalities. They have their own local autonomy. They have their areas where neither the cantons nor the federal state can have a say. Then we have 26 autonomous cantons. These are actually state-like entities. I mean, they have their own institutions, they have their own jurisdiction at cantonal level, and they have quite important powers Actually, in the federal constitution, all the powers are with the cantons, except that they are attributed to the federal state. Of course, with time, it was more and more also that was given to the central level, but still there are important areas such as education, justice, police, culture, that health as well, hospitals, that are mainly in the cantonal competence, and not to forget tax competencies. I mean, you have found many federal states around the world, but the real test, in my view, is always to the entities below the central government. Do they have real tax competence? Can they tax people? Can they tax companies, etc.? Most of the time they cannot, so they have to wait for money or beg for money rather from the central government. We need this or that, so you are always dependent. This is not a real concept of federalism as we have it in Switzerland. So federalism, this very strong decentralization comes first in Switzerland. And sometimes it collides with democracy, you know, because as we will see, we have two chambers in parliament. The second one is the one of the cantons, of the states, and every canton has 2 seats there, 2 votes, whether it's small like Appenzell or it's the biggest like Zurich, with 1 million or more than 1 million of inhabitants. So that's accepted in Switzerland because we say, well, they have their say. That tells a historic, of course, a historic fact. And then, well, the third element is this power sharing. I will explain that later. Now, direct democracy, we leave now the issue of federalism, but direct democracy, well, it has its roots, of course, even in centuries back. There is this myth, you know, Switzerland having been founded by this famous oath to chase foreign judges out of Switzerland. We had this kind of foreign judges, and anyway, this self-government was strongly rooted in Swiss history. It's also linked to, let's say, in the mountains, because Switzerland, the nucleus of Switzerland was here, with the cantons of Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden, along the Gotthard. And well, people had to organize themselves, you know, to survive. So, for instance, Alps, where the cows would grow collectively, and so there is a tradition of that. But as I said before, until the Napoleonic Wars, Switzerland then was not really a land where all the people were equal. We had also our own aristocracies, and of course these new revolutionary ideas of France, of Napoleon, they changed Switzerland quite profoundly. But one can say that Switzerland was probably the only, or one of the few countries in Europe that really implemented the revolutionary principles in the 19th century, while all the rest of Europe returned to the old order, with all the results that we know, very bad results. So, this is how it happened in Switzerland. Of course, this was in Switzerland was a very also big tension and a difficult process in order to create this modern Swiss federal state in 1848. It began in the cantons, so again bottom up, where people asked for participation in political processes, and they already changed their constitutions at the cantonal level. At the federal level, the instruments of direct democracy, that's to say possibility of a referendum on constitutional changes or laws, was introduced in 1874, and then in 1891 also the instrument of a popular initiative for changing the federal constitution. We will see how that works. And later on, in 1921, there was a further extension of the scope, namely also extension of participation of the people in international treaties. This is very important for us diplomats in particular. It's also quite, you can imagine, can be quite delicate when people have a say in major foreign policy decisions, but basically it's quite logical, you know, because these treaties or membership in important organization, of course, can have as much consequences for the people as do normal laws. By the way, this introduction of reform for international treaties was introduced because of the first Gotthard tunnel that was co-financed by Italy and Germany at the time, and this created some tensions domestically because of course they had a say there, and this was actually challenged because this was a very long-term treaty, and people say it cannot be that the government can conclude such a treaty without our participation. Yesterday, you may have noticed that we just inaugurated a new base tunnel, the longest railway tunnel of the world, Gotthard, so the story goes on, but it was wholly financed by Switzerland because Europe thinks Switzerland can do it alone. An interesting story. Now, as I said before, actually direct democracy first came up in the cantons, and so the cantons have all those instruments as well, also the communes, so which means that normally we vote 4 times a year, so every 3 months, on all kinds of issues that concern the federal level, the canton where we live, and also the commune where we live. There is still this very, let's say, original form of direct democracy, namely what is called Landsgemeinde. So to say that all the citizens that have the right to vote, they assemble here on the central square of Canton of Glaris is here. This is actually the canton of my origin, my grandfather's origin, and so you see how they vote. Of course, there's no secrecy voting in this system, as is normally the case. So you know what your neighbor votes. Well, that's interesting. But of course, it's a very direct communication. And it happened that, for instance, in this canton, there were, I think, roughly 35 municipalities, and it was somehow a problem in terms of having enough the capacities to do the state they had to do in terms of financing, etc. And there was at one of those Landsgemeinde, a citizen said, we should really radically reduce and just have three communes in this canton. And it was accepted, although the government was against. So you can see that this can have quite revolutionary effects. Now, of course, when you look at it, Switzerland has in fact a semi-direct democracy. They say we also vote for our parliaments, our parliamentarians, as most countries in the world do, and the parliament, of course, then adopts laws, adopts treaties, etc., and it elects our government. So there is no direct election of the government at the federal level, although there is at the cantonal level, and it's intentional. We want the federal government not to become some kind of a cheap populist election campaign, and so it's actually Parliament that does it. What is interesting, but that's the subject apart, is the Federal Supreme Court can, of course, control the cantonal constitution, it can control also the cantonal laws, whether they are constitutional, but it cannot control federal laws on constitutionality. You can go to Strasbourg, to the European Court of Human Rights, if you think a decision violates your laws, a court decision in Switzerland, but the court cannot control federal laws. This is quite unique, I think, in international comparison. Again, this is intentional. In Switzerland, the people is considered sovereign. It's the people that says and decides what is right and what should be the law, and not some judges. And so, very important questions that also concern people's life, like, let's say, abortion. In Germany, you very often, typically in Germany, with all this, let's say, difficult historic experience under Nazi dictatorship, so they delegate a lot to their courts to decide on question where we would consider this is political. It has to be political decision under what condition, let's say, abortion is allowed or not. You cannot delegate this to the judges. So, well, as I said, the voters can elect the parliamentarians, but they have these two extra instruments, popular initiative and referendum, to participate directly in political decisions. What we cannot do in Switzerland is to call elected officials, to say, I don't like the mayor of this town, now let's move him away. It's interesting because in Poland, where I served a previous assignment, you can do that at the local level. And it's somehow typical, this comparison, because in Switzerland, our political system is really oriented to solve issues, to solve problems and have results, rather than a personalized political contest. Yeah. So in Switzerland, you have to accept that people once elected, they are there for the term, 4 years normally, and so you cannot just remove them. Well, we have here the referendum, which gives the people, there are two types, a mandatory one or a facultative one. So mandatory obviously is at the constitutional level, because this is considered essential, has to be anyway submitted to people, even if it was Parliament that initiated the constitutional amendment. And in this case you need a double majority, that's to say also the cantons, which of course means that a minority of the Swiss population can actually reject a constitutional amendment. But this is, so this might seem problematic, but it actually happens quite rarely, that the majority and of cantons and of the population would diverge. Then there is this possibility of a facultative referendum, this is to say, Parliament adopts a law and you may not like it, and then if you collect 50,000 signatures, but also it's a possibility that 8 cantons launch such a challenge, then it has to be submitted to the vote to the people. So people can of course disavow the Parliament, and they do. We will see the statistics later on. Well, there are a few examples. So we had a total revision of the Swiss Constitution in 1999. It was a very difficult exercise. You can imagine that oppositions normally then accumulate and everybody has something to object, but it was accepted finally. And of course in the international field, an example of any vote on joining the EU, but which is not really an issue in Switzerland at this point, would have to be submitted to the people for a referendum. For an initiative, you need 100,000 signatures. It's not so difficult these days, to collect that. It used to be more difficult. I will come back on that. And well, what is particular, you can only ask for a constitutional amendment at the federal level, not for any law to be introduced. That's a little particular. It of course has the consequence that we have very often some trivial issues in the constitution, because people may propose very peculiar things and it may be accepted, and then of course it's inscribed into the constitution. So here are just a few examples. You will see we voted on more than 200 initiatives since this instrument was introduced in 1891 at the federal level. So this is quite a lot. So here just a few examples. I will come back also on that. Now, of course, the question is, are there any limits to such initiatives in terms of content, in terms of what you can ask for. There are very little limits actually, and this is quite unusual also, I think, for other countries. There is one requirement, you know, you may not have different questions packed into one initiative, because then it's just for logical reasons the voter doesn't necessarily have a clear idea of what he votes on. Yeah. So there is what is called the unity of the unity of the topic of the initiative must be given. Of course, then at the international level, there are certain obligations, but they are not per se a hindrance to an initiative. Because if a new constitutional amendment violates international obligations, well, Switzerland has to bear the consequences. And this was the case in this initiative here that was accepted 2 years ago against mass immigration. It was by a very narrow majority accepted against the opinion of the government and the parliament, and now we have quite a serious problem with the EU in terms of freedom of movement, because we have agreed on this bilaterally with the EU on this freedom of movement, and the question is how to solve it. That's still going on. But of course there are, you could argue, there are some compulsory international obligations, especially in terms of human rights, that any initiative may not violate. But in fact, both the parliament and the government, they are very cautious in rejecting initiatives, in declaring them invalid, so they would not be voted on. And this again has to do with nobody in Switzerland can afford, so to say, to be against the people's rights. Now, obviously this possibility to vote on practically any issue requires quite responsible citizens. I was in many countries, and normally they would say this would never work in our country, no, because people would just decide to have less taxes, but then not, vote responsibly when it's about having more spending or less spending, etc. So you have to be, as a voter, I mean, first participate. You are a member of your country, and also co-responsible for how this country is run. That's, I think, a basic requirement. And there are, of course, many interesting examples. So this is one example that made headlines internationally, that there was an initiative from trade unions that said every Swiss employee should have 6 weeks of holidays at least per year. It was rejected. Most countries probably would say, people would say, well, fine, let's take the 6 weeks. But of course the Swiss, they think twice. They say, well, who will go to pay for it? And what about jobs? Will they get lost? Etc. So, and there are of course innumerable, very plenty of examples of, let's say, quite responsible behavior of the voter. I would even argue that maybe our voters, the citizens, are more responsible and more reasonable than our parliamentarians in many cases. Well, I mentioned that the direct democracy takes place also in foreign affairs. It's quite delicate because you may have less margin of maneuver as a government. You know, if your citizens say this or that, then you may be in a difficult position. The EU is quite a vital subject for Switzerland. Switzerland is in the middle of Western Europe, as we say, and we are actually more integrated in the EU than many EU member states. In terms of trade, in terms of economic relations generally, even freedom of movement. Switzerland has 10% of all cross-border movements of persons, workers within the EU, they are with Switzerland. And on the other hand, there is no question for the Swiss at this point of time to want to join the EU. I think what I showed you before, Switzerland's history, Switzerland, let's say, particular political institution, they speak against this kind of although we consider ourselves Europeans, we are in Europe, but joining the EU, where Brussels would dictate us a lot of things, it would of course limit the rights of the people joining the EU. And well, Switzerland of course is also economically strong enough not to join the EU, as opposed to many other countries that want to join the EU exactly for the reason in order to have a better economic development. We even said no in 1902 to the European Economic Area, which was a kind of an economic membership, not a full membership. So at the time, Norway and also other EFTA countries of the time that later joined the EU as members, like Austria, Finland, Sweden, they said yes, and even Liechtenstein, our small neighbor, said yes. Then we had, of course, in order to settle our relations on a more solid basis, we needed to conclude a series of bilateral agreements. Movement of persons was one major one, but many others. Well, you see that there was most of the time actually it was yes, but it was sometimes quite difficult. It was even yes to here in 2006 to the cooperation with new members, was to say this Switzerland paid 1 billion Swiss francs as a contribution to new member states, and it said yes to the extension of freedom of movement to Romania and Bulgaria. No other European country ever voted on these questions, frankly. We did. Well, it's our system, we have to live with it. But as I mentioned before, we had this initiative against mass immigration, which was, by the way, a consequence of having agreed on free movement of persons, and there was, of course, huge influx of people, particularly from EU member states, not even from outside, that came in, and it was so much that the Swiss felt, well, it becomes too much, we cannot handle it. And this was accepted, and that's why we have now is this question whether we can agree on some kind of new bilateral arrangement with the EU. Now, that's for next Sunday. It's the voting sheet I got personally by mail, so I can also vote while living abroad. And you see, these are five issues, three initiatives, and well, this one, for instance, also made some headlines abroad for unconditional basic income. So it is quite a radical initiative. You know, everybody will get 2,500 francs per month. I think half of the world would want to live in Switzerland. I don't think it will be accepted, but let's see. Asylum law, this is has been an issue in such votes for at least 10 years. Of course, immigration is a huge issue. It affects people's life, and so we vote all the time on that. I actually could vote electronically, so this is my the sheet for the electronic. So I rubbled already away the code, so but you cannot vote the second time. So if you try to cheat and vote on my behalf, it will not be accepted because it's already registered. It's interesting. This is not yet possible for all the Swiss. It actually was introduced in particular for Swiss living abroad. Obviously, because it may be difficult, you know, by post mail, etc., to do that. But in Switzerland proper, I would say 80 or even 90% of the people for years already, they vote by post mail. So you don't have to go there on Sunday, on this very day, on the 5th of June, to the polls. It's not necessary. And of course, I already voted 3 weeks ago, so it also changes somehow the campaign. So it's no use for me to watch any TV emissions on the issues because I already made up my mind and I voted. What is interesting, this is very often in countries where there is this question whether or not to introduce some kind of referendum, then the argument, at least in Poland where I was is always the government says, oh no, but this is too expensive. You know, this costs every time a lot of money. It doesn't cost, once you have the structures, but of course you need to register your voters properly, and of course that's a problem in many countries. But in Switzerland, of course, we are used to that, and this works perfectly. Now, I think that's an interesting chart. So it's the statistics of well, mandatory referenda and legislative referenda and popular initiatives. Since these instruments were introduced in the 19th century. Here with the mandatory referenda, so this, as I said, these are change of constitutions that are initiated by government or parliament. Typically, you see that 75% historically were accepted. So that's to say the people actually quite normally follow the government. It's not that they all the time would challenge what government or parliament decide. Then the legislative, so that's federal laws, as I said, that can be challenged. Actually, they are not challenged too often, but let's say on the average, I think it's roughly 10% of all the federal laws are then challenged and submitted to vote. If they are submitted to vote, you see here that there is actually quite a big chance, it's 44% of being rejected. So that's an interesting thing. So 90%, in 90% of the cases, the laws adopted by Parliament are not challenged, are not put to vote, because nobody objects really to it. But when someone objects, then in almost half of the cases, they may be rejected. That's an interesting observation. And well, with popular initiatives, it's quite different. You see that they only have a 11% chance of being accepted. Well, that's also quite understandable because often these initiatives are first brought in by outside. Actually, it was conceived as such, that even people not being represented in Parliament have the possibility in submitting something for a decision. When it was introduced, actually, we had quite one-sided government in the 19th century, a liberal government that ruled for 50 years. So the conservatives were practically shut out of federal politics. And so this was a concession, typically Swiss in terms of consensus, making that to give to the opposition the possibility to intervene. Now, what is interesting, I hear say there are direct effects and indirect effects. So direct effect is what you see here, but there, of course there are indirect effects. Because there is always this possibility that a law or a constitutional amendment will be challenged, you have to take that into account when you draft the law. And this gives, of course, all kinds of interest groups, lobbies, a huge leverage. They would say already in Parliament, if you do not change this article, we will launch a referendum, we will not accept the law. It happens all the time. And of course, Parliament has to make sure that the law is drafted in a way that maybe 90% at least of major interest groups and parties are satisfied or can live with it at least. If not, they will launch a referendum, and as we see here, with quite a good chance. There are also indirect effects with popular initiatives. To say the 11% of acceptance, it's not the whole picture, because government, even if the initiative is radical, government sometimes say, well, it might get through, and there were cases where quite radical initiatives were accepted against government and parliament. So they might make a counter proposal, either at the level of the constitutional, or what is called an indirect counter proposal at the level of the law, and say, well, we will change a few things, but we do not go as far as the initiative asks for. And this happens quite very often. So these are indirect effects, which again show that actually these are quite powerful instruments. Well, there is of course this, in the past years came up this fear that we might be flooded by initiatives. Well, it's obviously become easier with internet in particular to collect signatures. But even before, you know, if you were a retail chain, for instance, you could put people there, or people are in the railway stations, etc., and they can collect signatures. So to launch an initiative is not particularly difficult, and what should also be said that also major parties began to do it. Although, as I said before, this was originally thought of as an instrument for opposition, or even opposition out of the parliament to have a say. But now, of course, the major parties discovered this. If you don't get through your aims in parliament, you can also try to launch an initiative. And they did it quite often. But I don't think the situation is dramatic. You see, there was some kind of a peak here in around 2000, and now it has a little bit leveled off. What can be seen is that the acceptance of initiative, which is 11% over the whole period, since 19th century, it has gone up in the past decades. Yeah. There can be different, I think, explanations for that. I think my personal explanation, it's not that people become more radical, for instance, or irresponsible. Actually, there are quite acute problems also in Switzerland with immigration, with other issues, that where people feel government doesn't doesn't do everything that should be done to address the problem. And so they may have a tendency to vote for initiative, although they recognize it's a little bit radical, but we want to show the government it cannot go on like this. It's, I think, quite sensible. So it's not, it's relatively cheap in my view to complain, as many do now all over in Europe, to complain about populism, right-wing or left-wing, whatever, and to complain about citizens' behavior. They should rather look how governments work and sometimes do not properly address the problems in the country. Now, there are, of course, certainly also critical aspects of this system. I already mentioned the double majority for constitutional amendments, so cantons and the people, which gives the small cantons a very big weight. But, well, first it's historic, it's accepted. Also the USA have, for instance, these two chambers where the states have an equal say, well, it's not really considered a huge problem in Switzerland. Weakening of parliament, well, I think it's inherent in the system. If people can challenge laws adopted by parliament, obviously the parliament has a weaker position as compared to purely representative democracies, but I think we should look at the system. It works very well in Switzerland, it gives very good results, and do not forget it has a very high acceptance. What is decided once by the people, even very controversial questions like abortion or atomic energy, whatever, it has to be accepted by everybody. You have when I think of France now, where trade unions block the whole country, somehow they blackmail the country because they say, well, this labor reform adopted in parliament we don't like it and we don't accept it. And they say 80% of the French people don't accept it either. Well, but either you have a representative democracy and then you have to basically accept what parliament decides, or you have the Swiss system where you give people a say. But taking to the streets because you don't like what your parliament decides is, in my view, not a very efficient way. Of course, then thresholds to trigger, I said, that, well, there is always this question, shouldn't we have higher numbers of signatures to be collected, instead of 100,000, maybe 200, etc. I think it's legitimate. It was already done once, but that's 40 years ago, and maybe we should put that up. Then the quorum. We in Switzerland don't have a quorum for the validity of referenda or initiatives. such as in Italy. Italy has possibility of referenda, but then 50% of those eligible to vote have to vote, otherwise it's not valid. In Switzerland, we don't have it. It would block the system. So we don't actually mind if only 30% of people go and vote on a particular issue. Because those 70% who do not go, they have to accept the result. And it's their own problem or fault if they don't go. By the way, there were, but that has, I think, been abolished. There was certain cantons, and one canton was Schaffhausen, who they actually had the obligation to vote. Because you can say that it's actually a people's obligation to participate in political process. Well, then of course, that's an important issue. Are the people well enough informed to decide on very complex and tricky question? This is always an issue. I think in the Swiss case, so far, it has worked well, and I think one should never underestimate your own citizens. They are not more stupid than you parliamentarians. And the same goes for emotional subjects. The interesting thing is when in Paris or in France or in the Netherlands, for instance, they have a vote once in a few years on an EU question, as the Netherlands did on this Ukraine association agreement. Then the vote is maybe very emotional because they will vote against the government, because it's one possibility in a few years to tell the government we don't agree with what you do, whatever it is. So then the vote is a high probability. The vote is not about Ukraine, but about something else. Not so in Switzerland. The Swiss vote every 3 months on plenty of issues, so they really stick to the issue, and I think there is not a huge problem of being completely emotional and not oriented to the issue. Minorities protection, it's actually quite high in Switzerland. I won't go into details, because Switzerland will not exist without some privileges for the minorities. So not only that they have equal rights, they have actually better rights. This is something, of course, that the majority has to accept in terms of language rights, etc., etc. So it's very rare. Of course, human rights. There was this. You may have noticed that that was in 2009. This vote on against the construction of minarets in Switzerland, and it was accepted. Well, against government, against parties. Is this against human rights? I remember I was in Kosovo at the time, and the Grand Mufti there said, look, there's nothing in the Quran that says a mosque should have a minaret. So that's, and of course we have now other questions like the scarf, etc. School. So it's not a huge problem in my view either. Of course, trivial topics in constitution, but I mentioned that's true, but it's not a huge problem either. Slow, cumbersome reform of our system, that's an issue, I think. On the one hand, I think direct democracy helps to solve even very controversial questions like atomic energy. For instance, also in Germany, they don't have direct democracy generally, but they had this very tough issue on the railway station in Stuttgart with demonstrations for years, etc. So at some point they decided to have a vote at the level of the land, Baden-Württemberg. Well, it was accepted, and then the issue was over. There is no legitimacy to go and demonstrate further if the majority of people say, yes, we want this. So that's a big advantage, but of course there may be questions that are difficult to swallow for the people, like raising retirement age, or in the health sector, let's say toughening the rules that you may have to make more co-payments if you go to the doctor, etc. So these kind of reforms, they may be slowed down, they may even be blocked for years. But finally, at least this is my hope, the Swiss are reasonable enough to, with time, to see the necessity of reforms, and certainly in comparison, for instance, to France, I think we have quite a good record in terms of reforms. Now this is somehow an overview of our system with the system that prevails in most other countries, namely representative democracies. So one difference is our system is very cooperative. Actually, we are condemned to cooperate with each other. All the major parties, at least the 4 major parties, are normally represented in the governments, at the federal level, at the cantonal level, the municipal level. This is quite unusual. Other countries have a huge problem if there is a need for coalition governments. Even in Western Europe, Germany, well, it's going so-so. Sweden is quite tough. Netherlands, etc. So this situation where you have, let's say, 2 major parties and they change each other. Even in the UK, this is over. And in Switzerland, it's just a normal case. We have to, and of course. So there is no actually change of power normally after elections. The Swiss have election, then after election, well, in Parliament maybe representation of parties has a bit changed, but it doesn't change basically the picture, which of course makes us very stable politically. It's an advantage even in economic terms. Investors know Switzerland doesn't change its course just like this after elections. So we have a shared power. We need to negotiate all the time in Parliament. And interestingly, in Parliament, parties, or the parliamentarians, they decide depending on the issue. And you may have coalitions, sometimes the left with the center on certain issues, and then the center with the right on certain issues. It depends on the issue. So it's quite normal in Switzerland. There is inter-party cooperation, whereas this is sometimes very difficult in other countries. Of course, people have a direct say, we saw this, and well, these are some kind of slogans. You can say policies for the people in a representative system. People don't have actually a direct influence on the policies. They can be glad if parties have a decent program, but if parties don't have a decent program, a clear program, they may not even know whom they vote for or for what kind of program they vote for. In Switzerland, people can always intervene, you know, if they don't like something that the parliament has decided. Well, last question is this model for export? I would say clearly no. It's not meant for export. We have very good other export articles in Switzerland, from cheese to watches, but the political system certainly not. I mean, every political system, of course, is linked to a country's own history and culture. And as I said, other countries do practice some forms, various forms of direct democracy, but I would say no country to the extent Switzerland does. Not even the US. The US, for instance, have direct democracy at the state level. For instance, California is quite known for having even enhanced this, but they have no direct democracy at the federal level. Forget it. And this is quite some kind of imbalance. But I think, despite the fact that this is not exportable, there are, I think, important insights and lessons from our experience. One, I mentioned it already, is that we have a very issue and result-oriented political culture. So it's really generally not about attacking your political opponent as an enemy and to denigrating him. I mean, this is absolutely not in the Swiss political culture, but we are condemned actually to solve problems together. It's power sharing, I mentioned it. It's also this public consultation of public legislative projects. I mentioned the fact that because there is always this threat of a referendum, Parliament has to make sure that new legislation has quite a solid backing, also in the population. And now this is even, in my view, relevant for countries with representative systems, because very often government does not have necessary expertise for legislation. So it's always good to consult your drafts with other people who may know how to do it. So this applies to really to, I would say, any political system. And of course, last not least, the control of political elites. I think in many representative democracies we have this problem that people think they do what they want. We cannot control them. They spend the money the way they want, etc. In Switzerland, this is not possible, basically. People can always intervene. Well, and the final remark is political culture and processes are as much important as the institutions as such. You can very often observe that you may have institutions in place. I remember many countries will say European Union and other Western partners put up institutions exactly the way they are devised in our countries, but then they don't work like this. So that's, I think, also an important insight. Well, that's all. And if you have any questions.